Hallo und willkommen zu einem neuen Age of Empires 2 video, and welcome to all of those who might encounter this video because of its mostly English content and might not speak German. Welcome to my channel, to all of those, and this quick intro in the beginning is just in German to give a context to everybody else of my usual viewers, just to let them know what's happening. There will be subtitles in German, so this video is intended for all audiences. Also, dieses Video ist größtenteils auf Englisch, habt ihr jetzt wahrscheinlich schon gemerkt. Der Titel lässt es auch bereits vermuten. Das ist ein Interview mit einem sehr besonderen, offiziellen Mitglied von Forgotten Empires, also der Firma, die die neuen Inhalte für Age of Empires erstellt, nämlich dem Ersteller der Szenarien. Und mit dem habe ich mich ein bisschen unterhalten über den neuen DLC Victors Vanquished und auch über seinen grundsätzlichen Werdegang im Szenario-Erstellungsbusiness, nenne ich es mal. Und mit dem habe ich mich halt einfach mal ein bisschen locker unterhalten über diese Inhalte und ein paar Fragen grundsätzlich gestellt. Ich hoffe, euch gefällt es, euch interessiert es ein bisschen und es gibt vielleicht noch mal den ein oder anderen Blick hinter die Kulissen hier auch für eben speziell diesen DLC. Das war jetzt der Aufhänger, aber wir reden nicht nur grundsätzlich über diese Level, sondern über seine Arbeit im Gröberen. Und das Ganze mit deutschen Untertiteln jetzt. Das ganze Interview ist auf Englisch. Und ich hoffe, das hat auch alles technisch soweit funktioniert. Ansonsten kann ich nur sagen, viel Spaß mit dem Video. I hope you guys enjoy and skipped the German part if you didn't understand what I was about. It's just a little bit of context. And now onto the actual video. As promised in the title, it's an interview with Filthydelphia, the creator or main brain behind most scenarios that most of you might have enjoyed. Well, enjoy the interview. So, Filthydelphia, thank you very much for doing this little chat, this little interview. And welcome to the channel, I guess.
Happy to be here.
All right, so we'll dive right in. You have been active as a scenario creator for quite some time now, and I'd first like to know, when exactly did you start getting involved officially? When did that happen?
So I started first designing scenarios way back for Age of Empires 1 and the Rise of Rome in like 1998 when I was 13 years old. Now, that was just custom scenarios. And I was actually mostly inspired by some of the custom scenario designers back then, who, fully enough, a lot of them actually came from the German community, like Ingo Van Thiel. And so it was something that I did, as a kid. And then over the years, I kind of moved away from Age of Empires for a while until the HD edition came out in 2013. And I got back into custom scenario designing. And at some point in around 2014, I was recruited by Forgotten Empires to join their team for the African Kingdoms expansion. So I formally started working on Age of Empires in official capacity at the start of 2015 with African Kingdoms. I then continued with Rise of the Rajas, and then rest is history at that point. Worked with Age of Empires 1 Definitive Edition, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, and Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition.
Have you also been involved in Age of Empires 4 at all?
No, actually. Okay. That's actually one that I have not been actually involved in at all.
What about Age of Mythology?
That is something I am currently involved in with Age of Mythology really cool. Retold.
I cannot tell you how much I'm looking forward to that one, because it's actually like the one where I was using the scenario creator as a child a lot as well, and I think it had all of these crazy triggers in it that even I could understand at the time. It has so much more potential overall, I felt. I'm really excited and to see that.
It's a 3D game, so it's a 3D editor.
Of course.
And there's the god powers, there's the mythiness, there's a lot of power in that, or a lot of fun stuff, and the cinematic. So yeah, I think definitely something everyone will be looking for is Age of Mythology Retold. It looks really good so far. Yeah.
Well, we'll be getting news from that officially at some point, hopefully soon. I'm really looking forward to that game, but let's stick to the Victors Vanquished for now, I guess. But wait, you said that you first worked officially with African Kingdoms. So, were you involved all of the campaigns, or just a select few, or how did that go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that Forgotten Empires traditionally design campaigns, now this has changed over time as the studio has evolved. But originally, it was sort of the one designer per campaign, and they would basically design everything holistically. Now that's very rare in the gaming industry. Usually in most games, you have a level designer who may design the level, you have an AI scripter, you'll have artists that will place down like trees and objects, you have a cinematic artist who will make the cinematics, You'll have a writer who writes different things. The unique thing was that Forgotten Empires, during this time period, you would have a single designer make everything end to end. And that was partially a result of the fact that everyone on Forgotten Empires had come from the custom scenario design community. So if people know some of the old websites like AOK Heaven and Age Arena, a German language one, in fact, a lot of designers came from those websites, and so they kind of were used to making campaigns and scenarios end to end, doing everything, writing the story, designing the map, scripting the AIs, doing the triggers. And so it was a very unique situation that you could basically have an entire vision that you would create and execute. So for African Kingdoms, I worked on the Portuguese campaign, Francisco de Almeida, and then for Rise of Rajas, I worked on the Burmese campaign, Vang Yang. Then for the definitive edition of Age of Empires 2, I worked on Sforza, Prithviraj, Ivailo, and then later the Hotavias, the Sicilian campaign. Yeah. Did a couple other things with Age of Empires 1 Definitive Edition and then Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition, but my focus was always on Age of Empires 2 and working on those campaigns.
Okay, cool. So it's a big chunk of all the campaigns actually that have your, let's say, print on it or your involvement in it.
Yeah, I think at this point my math may be slightly off here, but I believe across the franchise, across the 3 definitive editions, I have worked on 78 of the official scenarios, give or take. Wow. Especially now with Victors and Vanquished and some of the event scenarios, like we have the Siege that just came out just recently. I worked on that, as well as Mangadai Madness also, and the Mongol Raiders, which was an event scenario that we had when we first launched the game. Yeah,
that was also a fun one. So basically you're the go-to guy for campaigns nowadays, so to speak. So now we have this new DLC that recently came out, Victors and Vanquished, which is a campaign pack. So it's 19 scenarios, and you've been involved in all of 19 of them. Since 14 of them have been available in different form and as mods or like as scenarios on the mod workshop that you had uploaded previously, and 5 are brand new. So my question would be, how did you select these 14 ones, and was it like completely up to you how many and which it would be, or how did that come to pass?
Yeah, so this was pretty much kind of my own initiative here. So one thing I kind of left off is after working on Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition and Lords of the West, I actually left Forgotten Empires and I worked at Activision Blizzard for a few years.
Oh, okay.
Around 2022, though, I came back to Age of Empires, but I came back at World's Edge. So for folks that may not know, World's Edge is the publishing studio for Age of Empires that's part of Microsoft. So worked here at World's Edge, and at one point I approached the team here and said, hey, I have a lot of these custom scenarios that are pretty popular. I mean, I think you mentioned earlier when we were talking before the interview, the Three Kingdoms scenario, Cao Cao's Ambition, and like that one I think has like 70,000 active subscribers. Yeah. So like there's definitely an interest in these sort of scenarios that kind of bend the existing mold of scenarios, right? They're not traditional build and destroy scenarios. They kind of have different rule sets, and they just different ways to experience Age of Empires. So I kind of came to the team with this idea of, hey, I made these scenarios, they're already popular, but the reality is that even though like Cao Cao's Ambition has 70,000 subscribers, that's only a small fraction of the Age of Empires 2 player base, and especially the Age of Empires 2 campaign player base. So the reality is a lot of our players, especially those on Xbox, but also a lot of PC players, they have never experienced a lot of these scenarios. And I'll be honest, I'll be frank, a lot of times people are they're not aware that there's this vibrant custom scenario scene. They don't know about it, or they just think, oh, this is, some mods, they're not as good as the official stuff, or maybe they're turned off by there not being voice acting or whatever have you. They're not really attracted to them, and so they don't really know about them. So the idea here was sort of open up this content to them, allow them to experience it, but at the same time allow us to sort of emphasize the vibrant custom scenario community that exists by really like emphasizing the fact that this was stuff that was on the Steam Workshop. This was stuff that was on ageofempires.com on the mod manager. This is content that's really fun that you can play. And there's more out there for free. So in a lot of ways, I kind of view this as an opportunity to sort of shine a light on a lot of the great custom scenario content out there. Now, of course, I didn't want it to be entirely just UGC scenarios, so I did create 5 brand new scenarios to include there so that players who had sort of followed me along the journey and had played a lot of these scenarios could still have something new in the DLC. And so those 5 scenarios are kind of geared to them, as well as the fact that the mod versions now have voice acting, they're localized into different languages. And so there's been a lot of improvements as well, like bug fixes and exploit fixes, to really make the better experience than it was in the mod versions.
And how did you select them? Like, how did you decide which would make a cut?
Honestly, so from the very start, I sort of was looking through the list and I was like, okay, I have a lot of them here. And I was thinking, like, is there a theme I can sort of tie this stuff together? I mean, I think as you know, a lot of our previous DLCs sort of have a theme. Now there's, after the Forgotten and the Conquerors, I suppose, too, there's sort of been a regional theme to a lot of our DLCs, right? There's African Kingdoms, there's Rise of Rajas, there's Lords of the West, etc., very regionally based. Now, when you look at these scenarios and look at the gamut of how many there are, it didn't really make sense to say there's a region for any of them. So at that point, I was sort of like, well, what are the commonalities associated with them? And then at some point, I was looking at the list, and it just hit me. They all have certain characters who, you know, in some ways could be viewed as like conquering heroes, or you're kind of playing alternate history and somebody that was defeated, like Constantine the 11th or Vortigern or King Stephen of England, like someone that was ultimately defeated, but like, you know, you can replay as them and try to see if you can win. And so it caused me to sort of like play with the idea of, are they maybe heroes and villains, or are they something else? And ultimately, some of the team had a really great idea, and they said, why don't we call it like Victors and Vanquished? Because that's effectively what it is. We have a collection of people that are, you know, the winners of history, and also those that sort of were the losers of history, those that got vanquished. And so at that point, I sort of was like, that's a great idea. That could be a great theme. And so then I kind of looked through the scenarios I'd made and said, okay, which ones sort of fit that mold? And sort of checked some in, you know, excluded some others, and so came to the 14 that I picked here, as well as 5 new ones that also would fit that bill. And so we hadn't previously had, you know, Charlemagne really getting his own scenario or campaign. Otto the Great as well hadn't had one. So I wanted to give some attention to them as well by giving them scenarios. And then obviously all the 14, you know, I picked ones that would fit from the perspective of like, there's a single person, a single hero that can be focused on. So for players who have played a lot of my UGC scenarios in the past, they may notice some are missing. Let's say, for example, Last Stand at Orkney is one that's fairly popular that was excluded. I excluded that one because I couldn't really nail it down to a single hero. So I said, okay, it doesn't really fit the theme of this expansion pack. So I'm going to exclude that one. If people like Victors Vanquished, they can always look on the mod manager and they can find some of my other works as well, and they can get to enjoy those. So that's sort of the way I approached it. It sort of came as trying to discover a theme of the connections between the different scenarios, and then including or excluding certain UGC scenarios I'd made based on whether they fit that theme.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It had nothing to do with necessarily the quality of the scenarios or the popularity of the existing scenarios, but more finding something that actually connects them to make it a rounded experience, so to speak.
I mean, I will say I did want to make sure some of the most popular ones were included, but I think there's also ones that just more recent ones that just haven't been discovered by a lot of players. Like I'm especially proud of Ragnar, which is one of the scenarios that if you look at the UGC version, it only has maybe a few thousand subscribers. A lot of players haven't experienced it, but I'm especially proud of that one. So I want to like make sure, you know, some of these less popular ones or less discovered ones also were able to be highlighted in this expansion pack.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we had, like, before we started recording, I had mentioned that I had particularly enjoyed South's Ambition, one of the scenarios of your Free Kingdoms campaign or story, however you want to phrase it. That one could have also fitted that theme of like hero-based scenarios or character-based scenarios. Wouldn't you say? Like, why wasn't this one in particular in there?
Well, I think one thing is that the time period sort of poses a little bit of a challenge, because it is a little earlier than some of the others. Like I think the earliest one I have in Victors and Vanquished would be Geiseric, who led the Vandals across the River Rhine around 406. Yeah. So I think that was one motivation. I know that, and the other was just the fact that there is a lot of complexity to that scenario, and to be honest, over the time, over the last couple of years, a lot of bugs have sort of appeared in that scenario. And so it was some balancing of being like, can I give the best possible experience right now? Or maybe that's something, for the future, maybe I should focus in on the scenarios that I think I can probably give players the best experience. And so that's sort of why the way I kind of approached that one.
Yeah, that makes sense, I guess. You touched on the complexity or the maybe bugs that can occur there. I was also wondering, since this is a scenario that is kind of representative of this style that you have of the choices that you give the players, of maybe approaching the scenario each time from a different faction, or having a character that can kind of find their own path within the world that you create. Is it significantly more difficult to implement this kind of scripting for a level? Is there that much more complexity to it?
Yeah, I think anytime you add the player choice, it does sort of magnify the complexity of triggering and just the potential for things to go wrong. Because you sort of think about it from this perspective. If I give a player, let's say, a binary choice of A or B, and then A leads to choices C or D, B leads to choices E or F, and then so forth, you end up having this complex tree of branching choices that can make things quite difficult to sort of, at that point, trigger it out, but then also debug and try to find out when there are problems that happen, how can I nail down where it is? Now, that doesn't mean that those type of scenarios shouldn't be made. Obviously, they're very compelling to have those sort of choices. It's just a matter of sort of managing how you can do it. Now, with scenarios like these where there's a lot of potential for players to make choices, but also there's different factions that you choose that you can play as, that sort of magnifies the scope. So the reality with some of the scenarios like Cao Cao's Ambition, or in Victors Vanquished, for example, the Oda Nobunaga scenario, which also allows you to choose your faction, is that you kind of have to set triggers for every single player choice the player will make. Every faction has to have sort of unique scripting associated with them. And so you turn what would be basically one scenario into the equivalent amount of triggers to 6 or 7 different scenarios, right? Because each player, each faction you pick has to sort of work differently. So that's sort of it definitely does increase the complexity. And like I said, if there's issues that come up, it becomes harder to sort of debug them, just because there are so many layers to those sort of scenarios where you can pick your own faction, or just scenarios where you have wide branching choices anyway.
I can imagine it also makes it far more difficult to actually identify issues if you have to play with every single faction and try to go to the limits of the decisions you can make within that faction.
Exactly, especially when you want to make the factions be diverse. So something like Oda Nobunaga, I had, the Japanese, it's ultimately a Japanese mirror scenario, right? Everyone's Japanese. So, but I had to make the factions be unique. And so I had to give them, special bonuses, access to different objectives and so forth. And then I had to also make sure the AIs would get that, because I didn't want a situation where, let's say, you play as the Mori clan in Oda Nobunaga, and these really cool explosive traps that you can build as the Mori clan. I had to make sure the AI could also do that. And so there's just additional layers that get added with something like that. Now, for other, let's say, scenario designers, custom scenario designers who are looking at these scenarios and wondering, oh, I want to make something like that too, I don't want to discourage them. I think it can be really fun to give players that option to choose their factions. Just know what you're sort of getting into at that point, where there's going to be a lot of complexity, because you have to layer in all the considerations and how the player will play, but also how the AI would play as those factions.
You opened a very interesting topic there with the AI. I was always wondering about that aspect in scenario creation. If you the basis of the AI is supposedly still one of the existing scripts for the random map game mode, I suppose, or is it not, or does it differ?
No, I would. That's an interesting question, because it varies. So it varies. There was someone who is currently Forgotten Empires. He's the campaign lead, who actually once upon a time had an AI builder, and this AI builder was something that you could go to. There was a URL for it. It was website.
Yeah, I actually remember that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it didn't end up being supported for too much longer. I don't think you could access it anymore. But, it was a way that you sort of just said, this is the number of villagers I want to have. This is the economy distribution that I want the villagers to do between food and wood. I want them to have access to these buildings. I want them to build this number of barracks or this number of spearmen. Or I, have a flag where you can toggle on and off whether they do, blacksmith technologies or they don't do blacksmith technologies, whether they do universal technologies or not, etc. That, and in the end, it would spit out a script, an AI, a per file that you could then use in scenarios. Now, the reality is that a lot of the official campaigns use some form of that. Now, it may not have been generated by the AI builder. It may be afterward a designer took one of those existing files, tweaked them in Notepad or Notepad++, changed the values to what they want to do. Now, fortunately, more recently, for Phoenix development, I think especially by the time of Lords of the West, Marius, who is basically like the AI lead at Forgotten Empires, he actually made another AI builder file that has several subfiles that control things like borloring and like all those sort of details. And the main file the scenario designer can use just allows them to sort of change all those values I talked about. The allocation of resources, how many units they train, what technologies they research, how frequent and with what size armies they attack, and also set them by phases. So you can have certain AI behavior set to phase 1, and then have a trigger that based on some condition, it changes them to phase 2. So therefore you can create these AIs that can be really dynamic, where they sort of have, let's say, a phase 1 where it's basically like they're just trying to get to castle age, and then phase 2 they shift into some other attack strategy or do some other behavior that you can govern, you can set conditions for via triggers in the editor to sort of change that behavior. So I would say the AI scripting has actually evolved a lot over the years, especially compared to when I was 13, 14, 15 years old in the 90s and 2000s making custom scenarios, where at that point it was very rudimentary. Now we have a lot more power to make compelling AIs that could feel more reactive and do more interesting things.
So you do not necessarily need to rely on scripting every single step that they should take, like attack at minute 5, do the war at minute 2, but you have a more broad script that you can adjust to what you need for the particular scenario.
Absolutely. And there are some downsides to that. And this is where it gets into an interesting discussion. And I see this all the time with campaign players, and they have discussions on this fact, which is, in some ways, there are some scenarios, some official scenarios that are heavily trigger based. So there are certain, let's say, those AIs don't have actual economies, for example, but they will spawn units at a certain cadence decided by triggers, decided by the scenario designer, and they'll do attacks based on triggers. Now, the beauty of a system like that is that it allows the designer to really curate the experience for the player. They can create a very, dependable, very reliable experience, and you can know exactly this is what the player will experience. And so you kind of create like almost a puzzle for the scenario player, for the campaign player, that these things will happen and you have to overcome them. On the flip side, you have scenarios that have more AI-driven enemies that, they have economies. They have to train villagers. They have to gather resources. They have to build their buildings. And their attacks are basically governed by the AI, where it's not based on, a certain timer necessarily. It could be, but it may just be based on, they have enough military units combined with a timer, combined with their town not being attacked, so they're able to attack aggressively, combined with they've already scouted the player's base, and so they know where the player's base is. And all these things together can create a very variable experience for the player, where any 2 times they play, the AI will behave just slightly different. There'll always be differences that can make the gameplay feel more dynamic. The downside with something like that is that you don't quite have that curated experience, where it's not so predictable. So one thing that we've kind of already sort of seen with one of the Victors and Vanquished scenarios is the Vortigern scenario, where you'll see players are sort of confused on when do the Saxons betray you. So in this scenario, you have this kind of like unique technology you can research at the Wonder that will give you a bunch of Saxon warriors. And you need those Saxon warriors because you're under attack by all sides, and you begin with no real economy. So until you can build an economy, you have to rely on these Saxon warriors to defend defend Britain, basically, Roman Britain. The downside, though, is the more of them you recruit, every time you recruit a Saxon federati, they're called, the AI, the Saxon AI player, gets a boost of resources. Now, what happens there, though, is that boost of resources, the AI, it's a script-based AI, how it invests, the timing it gets the resources, all matter. And so when players will see, I don't understand why, let's say one streamer like Ornlu, he had the Saxons didn't revolt until the year 475. I did some similar stuff as Ornlu. They revolted 10 years prior. What is the difference? The difference is in that variability of the AI. So the AI decides when it's going to betray based on it hitting a certain military population, but that military population is only going to hit that number based on how well the AI performs and the choices that the AI makes in the context of it scouting, in the context of it gathering resources, in the context of the exact timing that you do those recruitments that give it resources. So as we kind of know, if you recruit a bunch of Saxon Federati early and you give the AI a bunch of resources early, that has an exponential effect on the AI's development. If you stagger those recruitments out more, and so the injections of resources, come later, it has a less of an exponential effect on that AI's growth. So all these things sort of factor in. And so you create this experience that may be frustrating for some players because there seems to be an unreliability in the AI. But on the flip side, it actually makes every time you play the scenario feel unique and feel different and feel more alive because the enemy is AI driven. So again, both designs for AIs are both valid. They have their own uses, but there's sort of pros and cons with both that I love explaining this because I think it will help our players sort of better appreciate.
Yes, absolutely. What I also like to add, like the script-based AI doesn't give the impression that you're playing against a quote-unquote cheating enemy, right? Because you can tell, okay, I killed X amount of villagers, now I'm not getting attacked as much, and with a more trigger based opponent, you would probably not have that same relationship.
Yeah, at that point you're just like, I have to destroy the military production buildings,
or
right?
find the trigger that stops the attack.
Exactly. Now on the flip side though, a script-based AI may also rebuild their military buildings.
Yeah.
So you always have to, always have to balance that sort of thing. It's like now I have to find where the enemy is at this point.
Yeah, so you always have to kind of find which approach works best for the scenario you have in mind when you're planning all of this, right? Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, with kind of in this area, I suppose, would you have any more broad tips for people who are looking to create their own scenarios? That's not necessarily with the same complexity, obviously, but is there like a starting point that you can recommend?
Yeah, I would say probably the first thing to do is play a lot of scenarios. Play official ones, play custom ones. Just get a sense of things like pacing. Get a sense of things like, but look at a lens of the designer, right? Don't just look at it from the player perspective, but also think, why did the designer decide to do this? Or why did they do that? And sort of view it that lens. I think once you've sort of played a lot of scenarios and you've sort of done that, and you actually want to create something your own, my recommendation is never to just go right in and dive into creating something. I would say first, try to open up some of those scenarios. So one thing is, for all the campaigns that were released with Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, so not the DLC ones, the base game ones, you can actually move the files around. You can move your campaign files into your custom campaign folder, and you can actually extract the scenarios. And so you can actually look at the maps, you can see how they were designed, you can look at the triggers, you can see how, how the triggers were organized, what they do, and so forth. And you can, by dissecting that, you can learn a lot about trigger scripting, creating the triggers, right? From that point, if you have an idea and you want to create something, don't go straight to the editor to create something. My philosophy has always been, spend about half of your time preparing, planning outside of the editor. Open up Word, open up Notepad, open up Excel, whatever software you use, and outline what you want the scenario to be like. Decide on the players, decide how many resources they're going to get, decide how they're going to attack, decide what the objectives are, what's going to be the events in the scenario, right? Like you do this, and then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And if you have branching choices, start laying out those branches. Say, if the player does this, this happens. If the player does this, this happens. And sort of lay it all out in words, written separate from the editor. That will save you a lot of time, because a lot of the issues you're going to come into that are very frustrating when you've already started making a scenario, you can address earlier. You can start seeing, oh, this doesn't make sense. Or I've created too many branches, I can't manage it all. Let me trim some down, or let me bring some back together. Or this is not going to be fun, right, if I do it this way. And you won't realize it until you write it all out and you say, oh, this is actually going to be a frustrating scenario. So maybe I need to change this, right? Every scenario I've made, I've spent hours upon hours building the scenarios in my head and on the piece of paper, in Word, in a document, before I even started working the editor. Now, at some point, you may want to prototype some of the ideas. you may go in the editor, let's say there's a game mechanic that you want to introduce, right? You saw something and you thought, oh, if I can use these triggers in this different way, I can create this really cool mechanic. And so, for example, something like with Cao Cao's Ambition, I think that was probably the first time, as far as I know, that an Age of Empires scenario or custom campaign allowed you to pick which faction you would play as, right? So at that time, it was sort of like felt untread. So I prototyped it out. I made a scenario. I allowed you to sort of pick. I decided like, how would I want you to pick? And I sort of just saw like, does this work? And I sort of prototyped it. It wasn't the final version scenario. In fact, there's a version of Cao Cao's Ambition that's on my hard drive somewhere that's really simplistic. It's not as fun, but it was that core idea that I was prototyping out. Now, if you've done that, you've planned your scenario, maybe there's one or two things you've sort of prototyped in the editor. Now you go into the editor. Now you start designing. Now you start building everything, doing your triggers. I would say that's probably about 30% of your time building it. And then the last 20% is playtest, playtest, and playtest. And especially if you have things where there's lots of choices, you have to playtest every choice. You have to try it on standard, moderate, and hard difficulty. You have to experience it at every level so that you can actually make sure that players who are playing it in any way actually get the experience you intend. And when you do that, the reason why it's 20% is you're going to see a lot of bugs. That happens. Everyone's going to make bugs, no matter how well you prepare or how careful you are. And so you'll spend a lot of that time going back in the editor, especially in the triggers, and trying to find where was this bug, and then correcting them and trying to adjust the experience.
And then correcting the new bugs you create by fixing the previous ones.
Yeah, and then you'll go keep correcting it. Yep, and then basically based on what you experience in the playtest, you'll know I need to fix this. I need to fix this. So
right.
That's sort of like my recommendation. Again, just to say it real quick, is spend about half your time planning, preparing, then go into the editor, and then spend a lot of time playtesting. And I think that's the real key to success to how to make scenarios.
That makes sense. And I never thought about like this planning process in that regard, but that definitely adds up. I mean, if you have the whole idea laid out and maybe already thought about these little details and can see where it might or might not work, then you're saving yourself the time to build it and then realize it doesn't work, right?
Exactly. And if you go in the forums of AOK Heaven or Age Arena for many years ago, and you'll see people with these project threads where they were working on the same scenario for 5, 6, 7 years. And I can guarantee you, I don't want to say in every case, but I bet in most of the cases, they got so excited about going to the editor and they started working on things. And then they realized, oh man, this is too much, or this isn't going to work out. And then they just sort of wasted time just reiterating and iterating because they didn't take the time to sort of plan in advance and come up with the plan for the scenario.
You also mentioned the play testing, and then I assume you have done a bunch of that yourself for your own scenarios as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now there's one limitation to that. There's always a limitation.
I was going to ask, are you good enough for all your own scenarios? Because some are quite difficult.
It's two-piece. So one is, as a scenario designer, you don't actually have a true experience.
Right.
Because you made it, right? So you know what's supposed to happen. You know what you intended to happen. You will play with blinders on, and all you will see is what you planned the scenario to be like, right? It's unavoidable. Like, you can try your hardest to make it like, I'm just going to pretend, I could maybe spend, take weeks and months away from a scenario and just play test it again. And I might do a little bit better, but for the most part, I'm going to do exactly what I think the player should be doing. And then you watch somebody like, let's say in my case, it's like watching Ornlu play one of my custom scenarios. And he does completely different stuff, things that I never imagined. Or I watch some of the speedrunners, and they find exploits and ways to solve things that I never imagined, right? And so that's been a lesson for me, is it's invaluable to get people to play a test who are not you. And I know that's hard as a custom scenario designer. It's hard to do sometimes, but there is a large community of custom campaign players who would love to play something, even if it's rough, even if it's a draft, even if it's a prototype. They'd love to play it. And so if you're an aspiring scenario designer, I would definitely try to reach out to people and see, hey, I have a scenario, it's still in progress. I want to get some perspective. And if you can use something like Discord or something like that, or you can actually watch them stream playing your scenario, that is invaluable. And like I said, I made so many changes to my scenarios by watching players on YouTube play my scenarios and realize that there's different ways to think about the scenarios. And so that is invaluable. Now, the second piece of your question there was the sort of the difficulty.
Yeah, I mean in a sense, because I think some of your scenarios are definitely very tricky, especially on the hardest difficulty, obviously. So I was just thinking, if you already designed them in mind, like, okay, I have to set this up. I wanted to make it a challenging experience, but I still have to keep in mind that I have to play this. Is that something that ever crosses your mind?
So I do. To be honest, I usually view myself as a moderate difficulty player. So the way I sort of, my own personal take on this is, I should be able to beat something on the first try, maybe, or like one run through, I should say, one run through on moderate. On hard though, I shouldn't get completely stomped, but I think I'm probably making something maybe a bit too easy if I'm able to beat it on hard consistently. And that's just, I know my level. I'm not the greatest player in the world. I spend way more time as the narrator than I do playing the game itself, right? The reality is, you realize, is we have, a player base is playing this game for 25 years, right? You still have people coming in who are new. You have people who are not very experienced, or they're not very skilled. And obviously we want to make sure they have a good experience. But we also have players who've been playing this a long time, and they crave really challenging scenarios, right? So there's sort of this balance that you have to make between making scenarios accessible and easy to play and easy to understand, and then providing something for those really skilled players to not feel like they can play it one time through, win it, and it's easy for them. So I always, kind of look, I mentioned Ornlu before, but I'll mention Ornlu again, is a lot of times I see him play my scenarios, the custom scenarios, and even the official ones, and he'll just win it easily. And I'll be like, did he have a fun time? He might have had a fun time, but if there's value in him sort of trying to, puzzle it out or try again, I think those scenarios that he loves the most, because they feel like more of a challenge for skill level. The reality is, Ornlu is a very good player. Most players are not that. So we always have to sort of balance that out. Now, fortunately, we do have 3 difficulty levels: standard, moderate, hard. So you have to make sure, as a designer, you set those difficulties wide enough apart so that you can provide for players of all skill levels to still have a good experience.
And sometimes the decisions can also alter the perceived difficulty, at least, right? Depending on, for example, which faction or which route you take. It's a lot of
absolutely.
levels.
I mean, one of the most obvious cases of that is actually something where inexperienced players or less skilled players, they tend to want to turtle. They don't tend to explore and scout the map very much. And so, there's a tendency, like I often make scenarios where if you explore, you actually get a big advantage, because there may be Gaia units you can recover. You'll find out where resources are. You'll unlock objectives that can allow you to weaken your enemy and so forth. But for those players that turtle, they may never experience those. So even if a scenario is not that difficult, if they are willing to explore, it becomes difficult for them based on player behavior. So that's actually, you've hit on another vector that you always have to consider from a scenario designer perspective, is not just the skill level of the players, but that player behavior, and sort of trying to find ways to nudge the player out of their comfort zone to do sort of things that might help them if they're struggling. And so that would be, maybe there's a triggered event, maybe you give them reinforcements, maybe you just have messages that highly encourage them to go somewhere else on the map and discover something, so that they don't put themselves into a hole where the scenario becomes more difficult because of their play style.
I immediately had to think of the classic campaign from Jean d'Arc with the Orléans. I think it's the second scenario, because I had actual people like ask me as seeking for help. They said, okay, hey, I'm struggling with the scenario. Like I'm turtled in my city and I can't, seem to get out. There's too many attacks coming and I can't gather enough resources because of the confined space. And that is a scenario that also kind of still works as a tutorial, right? This is basically the go-to second campaign after the tutorial campaign, and it tells you, hey, we have to also protect our farmers. They're like right there, and we have to like go and save them as well. And if you go there, you get like 50 farms and a safe place for a second TC, for example. Like so, this is it's just an example that just popped right into my head when you talked about these encouragements. But I definitely would have a bunch of other examples of that as well, where it really pays off to at least dip your toes into the surrounding areas.
Yeah, I mean, goes almost into like military strategy, like real world historical military strategy. It's like you wouldn't want to just sit behind the walls all the time. 'Cause, like you want to explore, you want to get intelligence on your opponent, you want to scout, you want to find things. And so, I players, I think a lot of times would have a better experience if they're willing to think like a military strategist and do that, vice just think I'm gonna just stay in my base, get to Imperial Age, and then attack, right?
Not that that isn't fun as well, because I think a lot of people enjoy that playstyle a lot. Now I kind of touched on that topic. I would definitely wanted to ask you about the original campaigns as well, because you have experienced them only like as a player when they came out, of course. And which of them is your favorite? Do you have a favorite of the original Age of Kings campaigns?
Would you be open to including the Conqueror's campaign?
Oh yeah, let's include them as well. They're basically classical as well.
Okay, so I have a somewhat unorthodox preference that can be heretical to some people. As a kid, I really liked the El Cid campaign. It's one of those cases that honestly, it doesn't. I mean, I can't go into specifics, but even just looking, we can see play data and we can see how players play campaigns. El Cid is not really a particularly popular campaign. But what I liked about it as a kid was it really sort of conveyed that, like, I'm a medieval knight. And like, because most of the scenarios in that campaign, you start as, there's El Cid, or there's a very small force with El Cid, and you're sort of like moving around the map, and then you'll find a base, and then so forth. But it always felt like I was like a medieval knight who was it was like more hero based than some of the other campaigns, right? Joan of Arc also has that strong sense of being hero based. But El Cid sort of drew me in more, I think, just because of some of the stories of betrayal and the variety of civs you can play as the Spanish or the Saracens and so forth. So I was really drawn to the El Cid campaign. Obviously, the ending as well is quite heartbreaking, with Rodrigo Diaz dying and standing on his horse while Valencia gets attacked. And so that one really kind of attracted me, and in some ways I think it actually probably still inspired me.
I was thinking the same thing now. That sounds exactly like what you, or like as a basis, let's say, for this style that you developed later on.
Yeah, I think so. Now obviously I made all sorts of different scenarios, but I do kind of keep coming back to that, and in Victors Vanquished there's many scenarios like this. Ragnar is one extreme case where you basically just play, you have Ragnar, you collect heroes over time, you have war bands, and it's always at a small level that I thought was very interesting to be more like tactical. I'm outside of Age of Empires, I'm attracted to some games like Mount and Blade, for example, because you sort of are like that. You're just one person and you're operating in this world, and over time you start collecting more followers and you have a little army, but it starts at a foundation of like one person. And so I was always attracted to that idea, and so that helps color a lot of the scenarios in Victors Vanquished. But there are ones where are more traditional as well, where you do play with base and so forth.
Variety keeps it alive and exciting in the end.
Yep.
So I have one final question for you, which is a very basic Age of Empires 2 question that I have to ask everybody, obviously. What is your favorite civilization?
Oh, that's a good one. We have so many now, and that has changed over time. As a kid, I liked the Byzantines, and I think that's probably a popular one for a lot of people. I think for me in particular, it was because honestly, as a kid, I never heard of the Byzantines until Age of Empires 2. I bet a lot of people will probably say the same thing, just because the late Roman Empire doesn't quite get as much attention as it probably should. So it was kind of crazy to me to think, wait, there was these Romans that continually existed until 1453, and they had cataphracts, this cool heavily armored cavalry unit. I never heard about them. And so I always sort of liked that about the Byzantines. And obviously, as a less experienced player, I like the fact they had strong walls and so forth. Over time, I've actually sort of become more partial to one of the civs that I had a bit of more of a role in the design of it, and that is the Sicilians, where obviously at Forgotten Empires, many people are involved in the design of the civs, and these civs change over time with balancing and rebalancing. But since I had made the Sicilian campaign, a lot of the ideas of the Sicilian civ were kind of ideas that we discussed in lots of discussions and so forth. And so, like, the idea of having, the sergeants who can build donjons, a tower that can train more sergeants, and this idea that no matter what, like, you can't take on the Norman cavalry charge, because there was a period in the 11th century when Norman cavalry would just smash through all sorts of opponents. It didn't matter what you did against them, and that's sort of reflected in the Sicilians' bonus, where, you know, they don't take bonus damage from spearmen on their cavalry and so forth. I just kind of like that melding of gameplay interest, like just an interesting gameplay design, with the historicity of the civilization, which is the foundation of all the Age of Empires 2 civs. But I just like that coloring, how it was designed for the Sicilians. And I know that's another controversial civ that's changed a lot over time, but it's a creative civ that I think allows you to play it in a lot of fun ways that are different from a lot of other civs. And so I'm kind of partial to Sicilians now as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard of many people who would pick the Sicilians as one of their favorites for sure. It's an interesting choice.
I like that they're different.
Yeah, I can tell.
Yeah.
Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you. There was a lot of very interesting insights coming from you here, and also tips for scenario building. I personally haven't tried in a while, but some other people who are listening in hopefully can get something from it, or maybe I will be inspired to try my hands at it at some point again as well. And a lot of insights in the process in general. I think that's very, very, very cool of you to tell us all about this.
Honestly, I would view it as another pillar to the game, right? There's multiplayer, there's campaign, and there's scenario editor. And you can do, even if you don't make scenarios for other people, it's just fun to fool around in there, create pretty scenes, or just create little mini games for yourself and all that. So I highly encourage folks, if they have not gone to the editor, fool around in there, learn about it, and I think you'll find your Age of Empires experience will be even more enhanced.
Yeah,
it's another way to play the game.
Absolutely. I'm actually also convinced that because this multiplayer scene is so loud and prominent, like because it's so active, it makes it seem like this is the main way the game is played. But the single player is obviously a bigger chunk of the player base overall, globally speaking, and surely a big chunk of that is enjoying scenarios most of the time as well. So I always think this will always be an important part of the Age of Empires franchise as a whole, not just Age of Empires 2, of course. So yeah, you guys out there, we see you. All right, thank you so much for talking to me and for taking the time.
Thank you, Bacanero. I'm glad to be able to speak to your audience.